In the mystical realm of Elysia, ancient powers have long played a crucial role in maintaining the delicate balance between light and darkness. At the heart of this balance stands Elysia Moonshadow, a powerful guardian blessed with extraordinary abilities passed down through generations. Her connection to the elements and the spirit of nature makes her a formidable force against any threat that dares to disrupt the harmony of the realm. However, a shadow looms over Elysia's world in the form of the Bearded Skull, a malevolent entity from the depths of the Underworld river. With his dark magic and insatiable thirst for power, the Bearded Skull poses a grave danger to the very fabric of Elysia's existence. His sinister presence threatens to plunge the realm into chaos and despair, casting a shadow over its once peaceful lands. As the tension between Elysia and the Bearded Skull reaches its peak, a fateful confrontation unfolds, leading to Elysia's capture and subsequent transformation into a fallen guardian. The mysterious circumstances surrounding her fall and the dark forces at play create an air of intrigue and uncertainty, setting the stage for an epic tale of redemption and sacrifice in the face of overwhelming darkness. Elysia's ancient powers trace back to the origins of the realms themselves, intertwined with the very fabric of existence. Born from the union of celestial energies and earthly elements, her abilities are a manifestation of the harmonious balance that once reigned supreme in Elysia. As a guardian of the barriers that separate the realms, Elysia possessed a wide array of abilities that allowed her to protect and maintain order within the realm. Her connection to the spirits of nature granted her the power to manipulate the elements, control the flow of energy, and commune with the ancient beings that dwelled in the unseen realms. Elysia's keen intuition and foresight enabled her to foresee threats before they materialized, giving her a strategic advantage in defending the realm against malevolent forces. However, despite her formidable powers, Elysia was not invincible. The Bearded Skull, with his cunning and dark magic, exploited a hidden vulnerability in Elysia's powers, weakening her defenses and paving the way for his insidious plans to unfold. As the confrontation with the Bearded Skull loomed closer, Elysia's limitations and vulnerabilities became increasingly apparent, setting the stage for a battle that would test her strength and resilience like never before. The Bearded Skull's assault on Elysia and the barriers of the realm was nothing short of relentless, a calculated and merciless campaign to shatter the fragile balance that Elysia had sworn to protect. With his dark magic and malevolent intent, the Bearded Skull launched a series of attacks that tested Elysia's resolve and strength to their limits. The sheer power and cunning of the Bearded Skull outmatched Elysia's resistance at every turn, exploiting her vulnerabilities and weaknesses with ruthless precision. His ability to manipulate the very fabric of reality and twist the elements to his will gave him a distinct advantage over Elysia, pushing her to the brink of exhaustion and despair. Key moments of confrontation between Elysia and the Bearded Skull were marked by intense clashes of magic and will, each encounter escalating the stakes and the danger that loomed over the realm. As the Bearded Skull's relentless assault continued unabated, Elysia found herself facing an enemy unlike any she had encountered before, a foe whose darkness threatened to consume everything she held dear. The events leading to Elysia's capture and transformation into a fallen guardian under the Bearded Skull's control were a harrowing tale of betrayal and loss, marking a dark chapter in the history of Elysia. As the Bearded Skull's relentless assault intensified, Elysia found herself overwhelmed by his dark magic and cunning tactics, her defenses crumbling under the weight of his malevolent power. In a moment of vulnerability and desperation, the Bearded Skull seized the opportunity to strike a fatal blow, incapacitating Elysia and binding her to his will. With a twisted ritual of corruption and domination, he transformed Elysia into a fallen guardian, a shadow of her former self enslaved to his dark desires. The consequences of Elysia's transformation were profound, stripping her of her once glorious powers and twisting her allegiance to serve the Bearded Skull's malevolent agenda. As she enforced his dominion over the realm, Elysia grappled with the emotional and psychological turmoil of her fall from grace, torn between her duty as a guardian and the dark forces that now controlled her every move. As a fallen guardian under the Bearded Skull's control, Elysia's behavior and actions underwent a drastic transformation, reflecting the dark influence that now gripped her once pure soul. No longer guided by the light of her ancient powers, Elysia's every move was now dictated by the Bearded Skull's malevolent will, a puppet in his twisted game of domination. Using a combination of dark magic and coercion, Elysia enforced the Bearded Skull's dominion over both realms with ruthless efficiency. Through manipulation and intimidation, she maintained his control over the barriers and the inhabitants of the realms, ensuring that his influence spread like a cancer, corrupting all that stood in his way. Despite her outward compliance, Elysia faced a deep internal conflict as she enforced dominion against her will. The echoes of her former self, the memories of her noble purpose, and the bonds she once held dear, clashed with the dark forces that now compelled her to do the bearded skull's bidding. In the shadows of her mind, a flicker of resistance burned, a glimmer of hope that one day she might break free from the chains that bound her to darkness. We witnessed the devastating impact of his relentless assault on her powers and position as a guardian of the realms. The once mighty Elysia, now a fallen guardian enslaved to darkness, faced a harrowing journey of betrayal and loss as she enforced the bearded skull's dominion over both realms. The consequences of Elysia's capture and transformation reverberated throughout the realms, casting a shadow of despair and uncertainty over their once peaceful lands. The balance she once upheld now teetered on the brink of collapse, threatened by the malevolent forces that now controlled her every move. As viewers reflect on the themes of power, sacrifice, and redemption in Elysia's story, they are reminded of the enduring struggle between light and darkness, good and evil. Elysia's journey serves as a poignant reminder of the choices we make and the sacrifices we must endure in the face of overwhelming adversity, inspiring hope for redemption and renewal in even the darkest of times.